I watched my sister-in-law, Sloane, methodically peel the labels off my mother's prescription bottles before the body was even cold in the next room. She didn't look grief-stricken. She looked like a woman finishing a tedious chore. That was the first moment I realized that my mother's death wasn't an end for everyone in this house. For some, it was a long-awaited opening. "We need to be efficient, Marin," Sloane said without looking up, her voice as dry as the autumn leaves scratching against the window pane. "The house will need to be staged by the end of the month. Your brother and I have already looked at the market trends for this zip code." I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the smell of antiseptic and stale tea clinging to my clothes. My mother, Beatrix, had passed away less than 3 hours ago. The hospice nurse had only just left to file the paperwork. My hands were still trembling from the way I'd held her fingers during those final, shallow gasps, but Sloane was already talking about curb appeal and square footage. "The house isn't for sale," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle to my own ears. Sloane finally looked at me. She tucked a stray strand of her perfectly maintained bob behind her ear. "Don't be sentimental, Marin. It doesn't suit the situation. This place is a money pit, and Cashin and I have been carrying the property taxes for 2 years. It's time to settle the score." I looked down at the kitchen table. It was the same oak table where I'd done my homework, where Beatrix had taught me how to knead bread, and where, for the last 6 months, I had sat every single night while she forgot who I was. Cashin, my brother, hadn't visited once in those 6 months. He sent checks he made sure I knew were a sacrifice, but he never sent himself. "I took care of her," I whispered. "I gave up my apartment, I left my job." "And you lived here rent-free," Sloane countered, her eyes narrowing. "Let's not pretend it was a one-way street. You had nowhere else to go after the divorce, and Beatrix needed a live-in maid. It worked for everyone, but the arrangement is over now." She reached for a heavy floral vase, a gift from my father before he died, and emptied the wilted lilies into the trash with a wet thud. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. I realized then that while I had been mourning the woman, Sloane and Cashin had been mourning the delay of their payout. They didn't see a home, they saw an asset. I walked past her, headed toward the stairs. My legs felt like lead. "Where are you going?" she called out. "To sit with her," I said. "Before the funeral home arrives, I'd like to say goodbye without a spreadsheet in the room." As I climbed the creaking wooden stairs, I heard the distinct sound of a drawer being pulled open in the dining room, the one where Mom kept the silver. Sloane wasn't waiting for the funeral. She was starting the inventory. I entered my mother's bedroom. The air was still, the heavy velvet curtains drawn shut. I sat in the armchair by the bed and looked at the small, mahogany jewelry box on the nightstand. It was locked. It had always been locked. Beatrix had told me once, in a moment of rare lucidity 3 weeks ago, "Marin, the floorboards speak when the people won't." I didn't understand it then, but as I sat there, listening to the muffled clinking of silver spoons downstairs, I looked at the loose board tucked under the rug near the vanity. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached down, my fingernails catching the edge of the wood, and pulled. The wood groaned as I pried it back, a sharp contrast to the clinical silence of the bedroom. Beneath the floorboard sat a rusted metal tin, the kind that once held expensive English biscuits. It was heavy, weighted down by more than just metal. Downstairs, I heard the front door heavy thud shut. That would be Cashin. I heard his voice, deep, resonant, and practiced in its authority, mingling with Sloane's sharp tones. I didn't have much time. I pulled the tin out, tucked it under my arm, and slid the floorboard back into place just as the stairs began to creak under my brother's weight. I retreated to the armchair, the tin hidden beneath the throw blanket on my lap. Cashin filled the doorway. He looked every bit the successful regional director he was, tailored wool coat, leather briefcase, and an expression of manufactured solemnity that didn't quite reach his eyes. He glanced at our mother's body on the bed for a fraction of a second before turning his gaze to me. "Marin," he said, nodding once, "Sloane says you're being difficult about the listing." "She's been dead 3 hours, Cashin," I said, my grip tightening on the hidden tin. "Could we perhaps wait until she's at the morgue before we talk about commissions?" He sighed, a long, theatrical sound of a man burdened by a sister's irrationality. He walked over to the window and adjusted the curtain, letting in a sliver of gray afternoon light. We have to be realistic. The market is peaking. If we wait until the spring, we're looking at a 20% drop. Sloan and I have bills, Marin. The private school tuition for the girls isn't getting any cheaper, and as I reminded you, I've been the one subsidizing this lifestyle. This lifestyle involved me changing her adult diapers while you were in Cabo, I snapped. Cashin's jaw tightened. I sent the money that kept the lights on. Let's not rewrite history. You were struggling, and I provided a solution that benefited everyone. Now, that solution has reached its natural conclusion. He walked toward the nightstand, his eyes landing on the locked mahogany jewelry box. He reached out to pick it up, but I stood up quickly, the blanket and the tins sliding slightly. Don't, I said. The keys are with the executor, Mr. Vance. Cashin paused, his hand hovering over the box. A flicker of something, greed or perhaps just cold calculation, passed over his face. Vance is an old family friend. He'll understand that family matters come first. I'll give him a call tonight. You do that, I said, my heart drumming. He looked at me then, really looked at me, noticing for the first time the dark circles under my eyes and the way my sweater hung off my collarbones. You look tired, Marin. Why don't you go to a hotel? Sloan and I will handle the funeral home and the initial sweep. You need rest. He wasn't offering kindness. He was offering an exit so he could pillage the house in peace. I'm staying, I said firmly. I'm not leaving this house until the wake is over. Cashin shrugged, the mask of the concerned brother slipping back into place. Suit yourself, but don't expect the heater to be on high. We're trying to keep the overhead down. He turned and walked out, his footsteps heavy and proprietary on the landing. I waited until I heard them both in the kitchen, the low murmur of their voices sounding like the buzzing of flies. I retreated to the small bathroom connected to the bedroom and locked the door. My breath came in ragged hitches as I placed the tin on the closed toilet lid. I pried the lid open. Inside were no jewels. There were no gold coins. Instead, there was a stack of envelopes, all addressed to me, spanning back over the last 10 years. Most were unopened. On top of the stack sat a legal document, stamped and notarized only 2 months ago, a date when Cashin claimed Mom didn't even know her own name. I opened the top envelope. It wasn't a letter. It was a bank statement for a trust account I never knew existed, listing a balance that made the room spin. But it was the handwritten note clipped to the back that stopped my breath. To my Marin, it read in my mother's shaky, elegant script. They think I am empty, so I let them see emptiness. But I have seen everything, Marin. I have seen what they did to the business. I have seen the checks Cashin borrowed. Do not let them take the walls that protect you. A sudden, sharp knock on the bathroom door made me jump. Marin, Sloane's voice was right against the wood, soft and dangerously sweet. I forgot to ask. Did you happen to find the key to the wall safe behind the portrait? Cashin seems to think you might have tucked it away for safeable keeping. I froze, the bank statement trembling in my hand. The wall safe, Sloane mentioned, was something I hadn't thought about in years. I'd assumed it was empty, a relic of my father's era of prosperity before the bad investments Cashin always talked about had drained the family coffers. Marin, are you all right in there? Sloane's shadow cut across the gap at the bottom of the door. I'm fine, I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. I shoved the letters and the document back into the tin, the metal edges scraping with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the small room. I haven't seen any keys, Sloane. Mom didn't even remember how to use the microwave, let alone a safe. Right, of course, she replied. I heard her linger for a second too long before her footsteps retreated. I took a deep breath, looking at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. My skin was sallow, my hair limp. I looked like a woman who had been defeated by life, which was exactly the version of me Cashin and Sloane needed to believe in. If they knew I held proof of Mom's secret lucidity and the paper trail of their theft, they wouldn't just be pushy. They would be dangerous. I hid the tin inside a basket of dirty laundry. burying it under Mom's floral nightgowns, and walked out. I found Cashin in the study, standing in front of the oil portrait of our great-grandfather. He had swung the frame aside, revealing the small gray dial of the safe. He didn't even look embarrassed to be caught. "It's for the insurance, Marin," he said, not turning around. "If there are valuables in here, they need to be appraised immediately for the estate tax filings. You wouldn't want the IRS coming after you because you were negligent, would you?" "I wouldn't know," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You're the one who's been handling the estate for years, Cashin. You told me there was nothing left but the house and the debt." Cashin turned then, his face a mask of weary disappointment. "There is nothing left. That's the point. I'm hoping there's a stray bond or some jewelry in here just to cover the funeral costs. Do you have any idea how much a mahogany casket costs these days? Or the plot maintenance?" He walked toward me, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the scotch he'd clearly poured himself from Dad's old decanter. "I know you think I'm the villain because I'm the one talking about numbers while you're crying, but someone has to be the adult. While you were playing nurse, I was keeping the creditors away from that front door." I looked at the gold watch on his wrist, a Rolex he'd bought last year, claiming it was an investment for the firm. According to the letters in the tin, that watch had been paid for by a maintenance withdrawal from Mom's medical fund. "I'm going to make some tea," I said, avoiding his eyes. "Make a pot," he called after me. "The appraiser is coming at 6. "The appraiser, today." "Efficiency, Marin," he shouted from the study. "Efficiency is the only thing that saves a sinking ship." In the kitchen, I filled the kettle, my mind racing. The document in the tin mentioned a trust, but it also mentioned the business, Price and Sons Logistics, my father's company. Cashin had told me he'd had to sell it off in pieces to pay for Mom's specialized care, but the note said he had borrowed from it. I needed to see Mr. Vance, the attorney, but I couldn't leave the house. Not while Sloane was upstairs organizing, Mom's closets, and Cashin was downstairs waiting to crack the safe. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. "Gideon," I whispered when the line picked up. "Marin, is that you?" The voice was gravelly, older. Gideon had been my father's foreman, the man who knew where every bolt and cent in the company was buried before Cashin forced him into early retirement. "Mom passed away today," I said, staring at the kettle as it began to hiss. There was a long silence. "I'm sorry, girl. She was a titan. Even when the fog moved in, she was a titan." "Gideon, I found something. A tin. She left me a note about the business, about Cashin." "Don't say another word over the air," Gideon said, his tone suddenly sharp and alert. "Is he there? Is the wife there?" "Yes, they're already stripping the place." "Listen to me. Don't let them open that safe. And don't sign a single piece of paper, Marin. Not even a receipt for the flowers. I'm coming over." "Gideon, you can't. Cashin barred you from the property, remember? He said he'd call the police for trespassing." "Let him call," Gideon growled. "I still have the original Articles of Incorporation. There's a clause in there your brother seems to have forgotten. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Keep your eyes open." I hung up just as the kettle reached a screaming boil. I reached for the handle, but a hand clamped down on my wrist, startling a yelp out of me. Sloane was standing right behind me, her eyes fixed on my phone. "Who were you talking to, Marin?" she asked, her voice a low, terrifying purr. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sloane's grip on my wrist was surprisingly strong, her skin cold. I could see the reflection of the stovetop flame in her dilated pupils. For a woman who prided herself on being the refined branch of the family tree, there was something jagged and frantic underneath the surface today. "Just a friend from the library," I lied, my voice remarkably steady despite the hammer of my heart. "Letting them know I won't be in for my shift. It's a courtesy, Sloane, something people do when they care about their responsibilities." I twisted my arm back, and she let go, though she didn't step away. She stayed in my personal space, the scent of her expensive, clinical perfume mixing with the steam from the kettle. "You're acting very strange, Marin," she said, smoothing the front of her silk blouse. Ever since the nurse left, you've been darting around like a cornered animal. We're family. We're here to help you move on to the next chapter of your life. Why make it so adversarial? Maybe because you're treating my mother's death like a closing sale at a department store, I said, lifting the kettle and pouring the water into 2 mugs. My hands didn't shake. I wouldn't give her that. We are practical people, she replied, her voice regaining its icy composure. Practicality is what kept a roof over your head while you were finding yourself after your husband walked out. Don't bite the hand that feeds you, dear. It's beneath you. She turned on her heel and glided out toward the dining room. I stood there for a second, staring at the tea leaves swirling in the dark water. The hand that feeds me. They really believed I was a charity case. They had spent years building a narrative where I was the weak, broken sister, and they were the benevolent saviors. I checked the window. A heavy rain had started to fall, blurring the silhouettes of the oak trees in the yard. Any minute now, Gideon would pull into the driveway, and if Cashin saw him, the explosion would be nuclear. I grabbed the mugs and walked into the study. Cashin was sitting at our father's desk, a laptop open in front of him. He was scrolling through a digital folder labeled Estate Liquidations. Here, I said, setting the tea down near his elbow. Thanks, he murmured, not looking up. The appraiser called. He's running late because of the weather. He'll be here by 7. I told him to start with the furniture in the west wing. Cashin, I said, sitting in the chair opposite him. Why did you tell me the business was bankrupt? Mom's note. It didn't sound like a woman who was out of money. Cashin's fingers froze on the trackpad. The silence in the room grew heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He slowly looked up, his expression unreadable. What note, Marin? Just a scrap of paper I found in her nightstand, I said, playing it down, watching for his reaction. Something about the company, about you. Cashin laughed, but the sound was hollow. Marin, she had late-stage dementia. She probably thought she was writing a grocery list for 1994. The company didn't go bankrupt. I saved what was left of it by selling the assets. If I hadn't, we'd be standing in a foreclosed shell right now. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Where is this note? I threw it away, I said. It didn't make much sense, just the ramblings of a sick woman. The tension in his shoulders visibly dissipated, but his eyes remained sharp. Good. Don't go digging for mysteries where there are none. It's an insult to her memory to take her delusions as gospel. At that moment, headlights swept across the study walls, cutting through the gloom. A car had pulled into the gravel drive. That'll be the appraiser, Cashin said, standing up and straightening his tie. I looked out the window. It wasn't the appraiser's sleek SUV. It was Gideon's rusted, midnight blue pickup truck. Cashin saw it a split second after I did. His face went from calm to a dark, bruising purple. What is that drunk doing on my property? He was Dad's friend, Cashin, I said, standing up to block his path to the door. He's a disgruntled ex-employee who's been looking for a payday for 3 years, Cashin spat, shoving past me. I told him if he ever showed his face here again, I'd have him arrested. Sloan, call the precinct, now. I chased him into the hallway as he threw open the front door. The cold wind whipped into the house, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and impending chaos. Gideon was already stepping out of his truck, holding a battered leather portfolio close to his chest. Get off my land, Gideon, Cashin shouted over the rain. Gideon didn't flinch. He walked up the porch steps, his boots heavy and deliberate. He looked at Cashin, then at me, his eyes full of a grim, protective fire. It ain't your land yet, boy, Gideon said, his voice a low rumble. And if this paperwork says what I think it says, it never will be. Rain lashed against the porch, blurring the edges of the world. Cashin stood on the threshold, a silhouette of trembling fury. I'm giving you 10 seconds, Gideon. Then I'm calling the sheriff. This is private property and you are a trespasser. Gideon wiped the rain from his forehead, his eyes fixed on my brother with the kind of pity that cuts deeper than an insult. Go ahead. Call him. I'd love to have a peace officer present while we review the deed to this house and the corporate bylaws your father signed in 1982. Sloane appeared behind Cashin, her phone already pressed to her ear, her face pale and sharp. "The police are on their way, Gideon. You're making a very pathetic scene." "Marin, let him in," I said, stepping forward. I felt a sudden, cold clarity. The fear that had been simmering in my gut for months finally solidified into a hard, sharp edge. "Stay out of this, Marin," Cashin warned, his voice vibrating with a quiet, dangerous intensity. "I'm the one who's lived here for 2 years," I said, my voice rising over the wind. "I'm the one whose name is on the utility bills and the care logs. If I invite a guest into this house, he stays. Step aside, Cashin." The shock of me speaking back to him, actually challenging the hierarchy he'd spent a decade reinforcing, stunned him just long enough for Gideon to brush past him into the warmth of the foyer. Gideon left a trail of muddy water on the Persian rug Sloane had been eyeing earlier, a small, satisfying victory. We moved into the kitchen, the most neutral territory left in the house. Cashin and Sloane stood by the island, arms crossed, looking like a pair of high-priced executioners. Gideon sat at the oak table, his large, calloused hands resting on the leather portfolio. "This had better be quick," Cashin said, checking his Rolex. "The appraiser will be here any minute, and I don't want him seeing this element in the house." Gideon ignored him. He looked at me, his gaze softening. "Marin, your father was a cautious man. He saw the way Cashin was spending company dividends back when he was still in college. He knew that if he left everything to a simple inheritance, you'd be left with nothing but the dust under your feet." Gideon opened the portfolio. He pulled out a yellowed document, the ink faded but the signatures unmistakable. "This is the anchor clause," Gideon explained. "It was written into the company's foundational structure. It states that as long as the family home, this house, is occupied by a direct descendant of the founder, the company's remaining liquid assets cannot be liquidated or moved without the occupant's unanimous consent." Cashin let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "That's ancient history. The company was restructured 5 years ago. I personally oversaw the new filings. That clause is null and void." "Is it?" Gideon asked, sliding a second, much newer piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the restructuring agreement. "You changed the bylaws for Price and Sons Logistics, Cashin, but you forgot that your father moved the property title and the primary trust into a separate holding company, Beatrix Holdings, 10 years ago, and that company still operates under the original anchor clause." The color drained from Cashin's face so fast it was like watching a light go out. He lunged for the paper, scanning it with a frantic, desperate energy. Sloane leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the legalese. "This is a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This can't be right. We've already signed the intent to sell with the brokerage." "Then you'd better call them and cancel," I said, leaning back against the counter. I felt a strange, light-headed sensation, the feeling of the floor finally stopping its tilt. "Because I'm not moving, and I'm certainly not giving my consent to sell a single brick." "You don't have the money to keep this place up, Marin," Cashin shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "The taxes alone will drown you in 6 months. You're being spiteful and stupid." "Actually," Gideon said, reaching into the portfolio one last time, "that's the other thing. The Beatrix Holdings Trust isn't empty. It's been receiving lease payments from the logistics company for 30 years. Payments you've been diverting into your personal accounts, Cashin. I've spent the last 3 years tracking the wire transfers." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to quiet. I looked at my brother, the man who had told me we were broke, the man who had watched me skip meals to pay for Mom's specialized medicine while he was borrowing her life's work. "I found the tin, Cashin," I said quietly. "I know about the trust, and I think it's time we talk about where that money went." A heavy knock sounded at the front door. Not the rhythmic knock of a neighbor, but the authoritative thud of the police. Sloane looked at the door, then at Cashin, then at the documents on the table. For the first time, I saw real, unadulterated terror in her eyes. "Go on," I said, gesturing toward the hallway. "Go tell the officers there's been a misunderstanding." Cashin didn't move. He looked like a statue of a man who had just realized the pedestal was made of salt. The heavy thumping at the door continued, more insistent now. Sloane's composure finally shattered. She let out a jagged, panicked breath and rushed toward the foyer, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the hardwood. "Wait, Sloane," Cashin hissed, but it was too late. I followed them into the hall, Gideon trailing behind me like a silent, weathered guardian. Through the frosted glass of the front door, the blue and red lights of the patrol car pulsed against the rain, casting rhythmic bruises across the wallpaper. Sloane threw the door open. 2 officers stood there, their yellow slickers dripping. "There's a man, a trespasser," she started, her voice high and unstable. "We called because we felt threatened." The older officer, a man with a graying mustache and tired eyes, looked past her at Gideon, then at me. He didn't look like a man arriving at a crime scene. He looked like a man who had seen too many family squabbles in this zip code. "Marin," the officer asked, ignoring Sloane entirely, "is everything all right here? We got a call about an intruder." "Hello, Officer Holloway," I said, stepping forward. I'd seen him dozens of times over the last year. He was the one who had helped me find Mom the night she'd wandered out the front door in her nightgown, thinking she was going to the grocery store. "There's no intruder. This is Gideon, a family friend. He's here at my invitation to help with some of my mother's affairs." Holloway looked at Cashin, whose face was currently a sickly shade of gray. "Your sister says he's a guest, Mr. Price. Is there a problem?" Cashin's throat worked as he swallowed. He looked at Gideon's portfolio, then at the officers. He knew that if he pushed it, if he made a scene, the paperwork would become part of an official report. And if there was one thing Cashin feared more than poverty, it was a public record of his failures. "A misunderstanding," Cashin said, the words sounding like they were being pulled out of him with pliers. "My sister is under a lot of emotional stress. Her judgment is a bit clouded today. My apologies for wasting your time, Holloway." "Stress," I interjected, my voice low and dangerously calm. "I'm not the one who's shaking, Cashin." Officer Holloway lingered for a moment, his gaze shifting between the 4 of us. He knew something was rotting under the floorboards of this conversation, but without a crime to report, his hands were tied. "Right. Well, my condolences on your mother's passing, Marin. If you need anything at all, you call the station directly." He tipped his cap and stepped back into the rain. As the door closed, the click of the latch sounded like a guillotine. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sloane turned on me, her finger trembling as she pointed it at my face. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Dragging this thug into our family business. You have no idea the legal nightmare you've just invited into this house." "The only nightmare here, Sloane, is the one Cashin signed his name to," Gideon said, tapping the leather portfolio. "Get out," Cashin whispered. He wasn't looking at Gideon anymore. He was looking at me. "Get out of this house, Marin. I don't care about the clause. I'll tie you up in probate court for the next decade. I'll make sure you don't see a dime of that trust until you're too old to spend it." "I'm not leaving," I said, crossing my arms. "And as for the trust, I think you should worry less about when I'll see the money and more about who else is going to see those wire transfers. Because Gideon didn't just find the trail, he found the destination." Gideon nodded slowly. "The Beatrix Holdings funds weren't just going to tuition, Cashin. They were going into a shell company called CP Development, a company that's currently being sued for a failed condo project in the city. You weren't just borrowing Mom's money, you were losing it." Cashin lunged then, not at me, but at the portfolio in Gideon's hand. Gideon, despite his age, moved with the sudden, blunt force of a man who had spent 40 years on a loading dock. He caught Cashin's wrists and shoved him back against the wall. The sound of my brother's back hitting the plaster was sickeningly dull. "Enough," I screamed. They both froze. I looked at the 2 of them, the brother I once looked up to and the man who had been a second father to me. Then I looked at Sloane, who was staring at the wall safe behind the portrait, her eyes darting as if looking for a way to break into it with her bare teeth. "Cashin," I said, my voice trembling with a decade of suppressed grief. "I want the truth. Now, before I let Gideon take those papers to the district attorney. My brother slumped against the wall, his expensive coat bunched up around his neck. For the first time in my life, he looked small. I was going to put it back, he croaked. The project, it was a sure thing. I just needed a bridge loan. I was protecting the family legacy, Marin. I was trying to build something bigger. By stealing from a woman who couldn't remember her own name, I asked. The front door opened again. This time, it wasn't the police. It was a man in a sharp charcoal suit carrying a professional camera and a laser measuring tool. The appraiser. Mr. Price? The man asked, stepping into the foyer and shaking his umbrella. Sorry I'm late. The weather is a disaster. Ready to start the inventory. I looked at Cashin. I looked at the way he desperately tried to straighten his tie, to pull the mask of the successful man back over his crumbling face. The inventory is already finished, I said to the appraiser. But please, come in. I think you should start with the silver in the dining room. My sister-in-law has already been kind enough to set it out for you. Appraiser, a man named Mr. Sterling, moved through the house with a detached, clinical efficiency that felt like salt in an open wound. He clicked his laser measure against the walls of the dining room, the red dot dancing across the portrait of my mother as if he were marking her for deletion. Sloane stood by the sideboard, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She was trying to maintain the facade of a helpful homeowner, but every time Sterling picked up a piece of silver to check the hallmark, her eyes flickered toward Cashin. My brother was leaning against the doorframe, nursing a fresh drink, his gaze fixed on the floor. The elite couple was unraveling, stitch by agonizing stitch. This George IIIT service, Sterling remarked, turning a teapot over in his gloved hands. Excellent condition, high provenance. It'll do well at a private auction. I'd estimate its value at roughly $12,000. 13, Sloane corrected instinctively, her voice brittle. It was appraised 5 years ago for 13. The market has shifted, Mrs. Price, Sterling said without looking up. Sentiment doesn't dictate value, scarcity does. I stood in the corner, Gideon a silent shadow behind me. Every item Sterling catalogued felt like a limb being severed. The clock, the rug, the hand-carved hutch that held the good china we only used on birthdays. These weren't just assets, they were the physical evidence of a life lived with dignity. Marin, Cashin muttered, his voice thick. He didn't look at me. Be reasonable. Sterling is here. Let him finish. If we sell the contents, we can cover the immediate debts. We can keep the creditors away from the business accounts for another 90 days. It buys us time, too. Fix the discrepancies Gideon found. You mean time to hide the rest of the money? I asked. I mean time to save our name, he snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot. Do you want the Price name dragged through the mud? Do you want the neighbors to know we're broke, that our father's company was a house of cards? It wasn't a house of cards until you started pulling out the foundation, Cashin, I said. I turned to Mr. Sterling. How much for the mahogany jewelry box upstairs, the one on the nightstand? Sterling paused. I haven't reached the bedrooms yet, Miss Price, but mahogany of that age, if the marquetry is intact, perhaps 800 to 1,000. And the contents? I asked, my heart hammering. I'd need the key to verify. I looked at Cashin. Where is the key, Cashin? I know Mom didn't lose it. She was obsessed with that box. Even when she forgot my name, she'd stroke the lid of that box like it was a living thing. Cashin's jaw worked, but he said nothing. It was Sloane who spoke, her voice dripping with a forced, condescending pity. Marin, let it go. The box is empty. Cashin checked it months ago when we were looking for her insurance papers. It's just a sentimental relic. Empty, I whispered. I looked at Gideon. He gave me a small, knowing nod. He knew what I was thinking. If the box was empty, why was Cashin so intent on keeping it locked? Why had he looked so panicked when I mentioned Mr. Vance, the attorney? Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice gaining strength. I'd like you to pause the appraisal for a moment. There's a specific item I need to locate, a legal requirement for the estate. Of course, Sterling said, sensing the shift in the room's temperature. He set the teapot down and stepped back. I walked toward the stairs. "Cashin, give me the key." "I told you I don't have it," he lied, his voice cracking. "You have it," I said, stopping on the first step and looking down at him. "You've had it since the day you moved her into the hospice wing. You thought if you kept it locked, you could control the narrative. But the floorboards already spoke. Now I want the rest of the truth." I held out my hand. The silence in the foyer was so heavy I could hear the rain dripping off the eaves outside. Cashin looked at Sloane, seeking a lifeline, but she was busy staring at her reflection in the darkened window. A woman realizing her reflection was starting to blur. Slowly, with the movements of a man defeated, Cashin reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, tarnished silver key on a black ribbon. "It won't change anything, Marin," he whispered as he handed it to me. "It'll just make you hate her more." I didn't answer. I took the key and ran up the stairs, the cold metal biting into my palm. I reached the bedroom, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mother's bed, and placed the box in my lap. The key slid into the lock with a soft, oily click. I lifted the lid. The interior was lined with faded blue velvet. There were no diamonds, no gold, just a single folded piece of parchment and a small digital voice recorder. I pressed the play button. "Marin," my mother's voice filled the room, sounding younger, stronger than I'd heard it in years. "If you're hearing this, it means Cashin has finally run out of shadows to hide in." Voice on the recorder was steady, stripped of the confusion and the drifting pauses that had defined my mother's final years. This was the Beatrix who had run a boardroom, the woman who could silence a room with a single, arched eyebrow. "Marin," the recording continued, the sound of a distant siren wailing in the background of wherever she had been when she filmed this. I knew the fog was coming. I felt the edges of my mind fraying like an old rug, and I saw your brother watching it happen. I saw the way he looked at my signatures, not as a son, but as an opportunist. He thinks he's clever, but he has always been transparent in his greed. I felt a tear track down my cheek, cold and stinging. I looked at the bed where she had died, her body gone now, but her presence suddenly louder than it had been in months. "He will try to tell you the business is a ghost. He will try to tell you that I am a burden. But Marin, listen to me. The Beatrix Holdings account was never for me. It was the payout from the insurance policy I took out on your father's life, money Cashin never knew existed because I kept it in my maiden name. I knew if he found it. He'd burn through it in a week. I left it for you, Marin. Not because you're weak, but because you're the only one with a heart big enough to keep this family's history from being sold for parts." There was a heavy thud of footsteps on the stairs. I didn't turn off the recorder. I wanted them to hear it. Cashin and Sloane appeared in the doorway, their faces pale in the dim light of the hallway. They stopped as my mother's voice vibrated through the small plastic speaker. "Cashin," the recording said, and my brother flinched as if she'd slapped him. "I know about the condo project. I know about the loans you took from the logistics payroll. I let you think I didn't notice because I wanted to see if you had a shred of conscience left. If you are hearing this, it means you chose the house over your sister. It means you chose the silver over the truth." The recording ended with a sharp, digital click. The silence that followed was more deafening than the voice. "It's a fabrication," Sloane whispered, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She was out of her mind. You can't use a recording from a woman with dementia as a legal document. "It's not just a recording, Sloane," I said, picking up the folded parchment from the box. I opened it. It wasn't a letter. It was a secondary deed, a transfer of the property title from Beatrix Holdings directly to me, signed and witnessed by Mr. Vance and Gideon 18 months ago. "She didn't just leave me the money," I said, looking at Cashin. "She left me the house, all of it. The land, the walls, the furniture Sterling is downstairs counting right now. It's all mine." Cashin's face went from pale to a terrifying mottled purple. "That's impossible. I'm the executor. I have the power of attorney." "Which expired the moment she died," Gideon's voice came from the hallway. He was standing behind them, leaning against the doorframe. "And that deed was recorded in the county office the day it was signed. Your power of attorney didn't cover real estate transfers made by the owner while she was still of sound mind. And we have the medical evaluation from that week to prove she was. Cashin turned on Gideon, his fists clenched. You've been planning this, both of you. You've been sitting in this house, watching me spend my own money to keep it afloat while you held a hidden deck. Your own money? I stood up, the jewelry box heavy in my hands. You spent her money, Cashin. You spent the employee's pension fund. You spent the taxes. You didn't keep this house afloat. You were using it as an anchor while you drowned. Sloane looked around the room, her eyes landing on the expensive curtains, the antique vanity, the life she thought she had finally secured. What happens now? She asked, her voice small. What happens now, I said, walking toward them, is that Mr. Sterling is going to finish his appraisal, but he's not doing it for a sale. I looked at Cashin, whose bravado had finally, completely collapsed. He looked like a child caught in a lie too big to crawl out of. He's doing it for an insurance bond, I continued. Because I'm going to use the trust to pay back every cent you stole from the logistics company. I'm going to make sure those families get their pensions back. And then I'm going to decide exactly how much it's worth to me to keep you out of a courtroom. Marin, please, Cashin gasped, reaching out a hand. We're family. Family doesn't count the silver while the mother is dying in the next room, I said. Go downstairs, Cashin. Tell the appraiser you won't be needing his services for the liquidation. And Sloane, start packing. You have until the end of the week to find a place that fits your new budget. Walk down the stairs felt different this time. The wood didn't just creak. It seemed to breathe beneath my feet, as if the house itself were exhaling a long-held breath. Behind me, the silence of the bedroom was broken only by the sound of Sloane's sharp, panicked intake of air and the heavy, stumbling footsteps of my brother. In the foyer, Mr. Sterling was meticulously photographing the grandfather clock. He looked up as we descended, his professional mask momentarily slipping as he took in Cashin's shattered expression and Sloane's tear-streaked face. Mr. Price, Sterling asked, holding his camera at his chest. Is everything all right? I was just about to move into the library. The appraisal is over, Sterling, Cashin said, his voice a ghost of its former authority. He didn't look at the man. He looked at the front door, at the rain-slicked driveway, at the world that was no longer his to command. There's been a change in the estate's direction. I see, Sterling said, his eyes darting to me. He was a man who made his living off the wreckage of families. He knew the scent of a coup when he smelled one. Shall I send the invoice for the time spent to the usual business address? Send it to me, I said, stepping into the center of the hall. Directly. Cashin is no longer authorized to handle the accounts for this property. Sloane let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. You're really doing this? You're going to throw your only brother out into the street over a recorded hallucination and some ancient paperwork. Think about the scandal, Marin. Think about what people will say at the funeral. I stopped caring what people said the day you told me I was the help, I replied, my voice cool. And you aren't going to the street, Sloane. You have that beautiful condo in the city, the one Cashin invested so much of Mom's money into. I suggest you go see if the locks still work. Cashin flinched. The condo was the one project he'd managed to keep in his own name, a lifeboat he'd built using the planks of our family ship. He'd intended to move there after selling this house. Now, it was the only thing he had left, and it was drowning in debt. Marin, we can talk about this, Cashin pleaded, taking a step toward me. The trust, the logistics company. If you let Gideon take those records to the DA, I'm finished. I'll lose my license. I could go to prison. Is that what you want, to see your brother in a jumpsuit? I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the boy who used to share his candy with me, and the man who had watched me grow thin from stress while he bought silk ties. The transition from one to the other hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a choice. I don't want you in prison, Cashin, I said quietly. But I don't want you in my life either. You've been a parasite on Mom's peace for a decade. Today, the host is gone. Gideon stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. I'll see Mr. Sterling out, Marin. Why don't you go into the kitchen? I'll make sure the guests find their coats. I nodded and walked away, not looking back as I heard the front door open. The cold air rushed in one last time, followed by the sound of muffled arguments and the slamming of car doors. Then, finally, the heavy click of the deadbolt. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The tea I'd poured hours ago was stone cold, a thin film of oil sitting on the surface. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. I was alone in the house. For the first time in 2 years, there was no one to check on, no medicine to dose, no one to hide from. The silence should have been a relief, but it felt heavy, like a shroud. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the voice recorder. I hesitated, then pressed play on the last few seconds again. The only one with a heart, big enough to keep this family's history from being sold for parts. I realized then that the justice I'd won wasn't a victory. It was a stewardship. I hadn't just saved a house, I'd inherited a ghost that needed tending. A soft tapping at the back door made me jump. It wasn't the police or the appraiser. It was a woman I recognized, Mrs. Gable, the neighbor from 3 houses down. She was holding a covered casserole dish, her coat dripping on the porch. "I saw the lights," she said softly when I opened the door. "And the police car earlier. I heard about Beatrix. I'm so sorry, Marin, she was a good woman." She handed me the dish. It was warm, the smell of baked bread and herbs cutting through the sterile scent of the house. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice breaking for the first time that day. "You look exhausted, dear," she said, reaching out to pat my arm. "Eat something, then sleep. The house will still be here in the morning." As I closed the door, I looked at the casserole. It was a small thing, a simple, neighborly gesture. But in the wake of the psychological warfare I'd just survived, it felt like a miracle. I set the dish on the table and looked toward the hallway. The shadows were long, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. They felt like memories. I walked to the window and watched the rain taper off. In the distance, the tail lights of Cashin's car disappeared around the bend, heading toward the city. He was gone. The greed was gone. But as I looked at the mahogany jewelry box sitting on the counter, I knew the story wasn't over. I had the keys now, but I also had the debt of the truth. I picked up the phone to call Mr. Vance. It was time to settle the score, not for profit, but for the people Cashin had stepped on to climb his imaginary ladder. Tomorrow I would start the real inventory. Not of the silver, but of the damage. The morning after the storm brought a strange, pale light that filtered through the curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the foyer. The house was finally still. No more packing footsteps, no more whispered conspiracies in the kitchen. Just the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant, lonely chirp of a bird in the garden. I spent the morning with Mr. Vance in the study. He was a man of few words, his fingers stained with ink and his eyes sharp behind thick spectacles. As he reviewed the documents Gideon and I had provided, he didn't gasp or express outrage. He simply nodded, his pen scratching across the legal pads as he calculated the cost of my brother's ambition. "It's messy, Marin," Vance said, leaning back and rubbing his eyes. "Cashin didn't just spend the money, he tangled the accounts in a way that will take months to unravel. But the deed you found in the box is ironclad. This house is yours, and the remaining funds in the maiden name trust are more than enough to satisfy the logistics company's creditors." "And the pensions?" I asked, my voice steady. "Every cent," Vance promised. "I'll personally oversee the restitution. It won't make up for the 3 years of anxiety he caused those families, but it will put food on their tables." I looked out the window at the old oak tree where Cashin and I used to play. I thought about the man he had become, someone who saw people as numbers and memories as obstacles. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I'd expected. I just felt a profound, hollow sadness for the boy he used to be. "What about Cashin?" I asked. Vance paused. "The evidence of embezzlement is clear. If you press charges, he will serve time. If you don't, he'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, knowing that you could pull the trigger at any moment. Which would you prefer?" I thought about the recording, my mother's voice telling me to protect the family's history. I want him to sign over his remaining interest in the logistics company to the employees' cooperative. I want him to disappear from this town. If he does that, I'll let the civil restitution stand as his punishment. I don't need him in a cell. I just need him out of this story." Vance nodded. "A mature decision, Marin, one your mother would have respected." After Vance left, I walked through the house one last time as a mourner. I went into the dining room and looked at the silver tea service Sterling had appraised. I didn't see $12,000. I saw the Christmas mornings where Mom had polished every piece until her fingers turned black. I saw the Sunday dinners where we laughed until our ribs ached. I picked up the teapot and carried it to the kitchen. I didn't put it in a box to be sold. I put it back in the hutch, right where it belonged. That evening, I sat on the porch steps, the air smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Gideon pulled up in his truck, but he didn't stay. He just handed me a small, wrapped package. "Found this in the back of the warehouse," he said, his voice gruff. "Thought you might want it back." Inside was the original brass plaque from the company's first office. Price and family. Not Price and Sons. My father had always intended for it to be inclusive, a dream that Cashin had tried to prune into a monolith of his own ego. "Thanks, Gideon," I said. "You're going to be all right, Marin." "I am," I said, and for the first time in years I meant it. "I'm going to open the house. Maybe start a garden. I think Mom would like the color." As Gideon drove away, I looked at the house. It wasn't a money pit, and it wasn't an asset. It was a vessel. It held the weight of everything we had lost and everything I was now free to build. I went back inside and closed the door. The lock clicked, not like a cage, but like a secret kept safe. I walked to the kitchen, heated up the casserole Mrs. Gable had brought, and sat at the oak table. The silence was no longer heavy. It was mine. I picked up my fork, looked at the empty chair across from me, and smiled. The battle was over. The justice was quiet, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.